This is A Deal of Fables and Faeries, a short story written by myself. The request for this work comes from R. Shadow, and the prompt states, after a long day as a prince, Roman goes running through the forest to get away from his duties. He wasn't expecting to run into a fairy named Patton. Thank you so much to R. Shadow for giving this request, and without further ado, we will continue on with our story. There were 3 rules to the forest of the Fae. 1. Never enter the forest, especially if dusk is approaching. 2. Never linger, nor follow the calls of the forest. And 3. Never speak to the Fae. Don't look, don't fight, don't follow them home. Just run. Roman broke every single rule that day. There was something to the crown that Roman found to be exhausting. It held him back, trapping him with orders and tasks. Too many pressures weighed on his shoulders, expectations that he could just never seem to fulfill. So he did the one thing that broke free of responsibility. He ran. Faster and faster until his legs burned with the movement. Roman surged forward, making it past the castle gates just as the sun brushed the horizon, soon to disappear completely. No guards came to stop him. They were all preparing for bed by now. The prince increased his pace, panting as he crossed the first line of trees. 1 step, and he had entered the forest. To say it was beautiful would be an understatement. Even with the blur of trees rushing past, he could make out the twinkling lights and moonflowers just beginning to peek out from the sea of greenery. He felt his boots pound against the soil, the dust kicked up, filling his nostrils with the sharp scent of earth and pollen. It was almost intoxicating. Everything in the forest seemed to have that effect. It pulled you in with lies coated in honey, especially the Fae. The stories had been passed through generations, ones of warning and fear. Fairies, they weren't like the other people of this earth. They were deceivers, possessing a magic unlike any other, and the tales that spoke of what they could do were enough to leave goosebumps on Roman's skin. No story could stop the prince from running now. If facing the dangers of history freed him from the responsibilities of ruling, then he was willing to take the chance. It wasn't as if he didn't know how to fend for himself, and Roman made a mental note to be careful, if not for the reassurance of his friends once he returned. At that moment, Roman was glad for his simple clothing. Not just because the maroon tunic and pants allowed for easier movement, but also for the eyes of the woods. There was no telling what anyone would do if they knew his true title. Any fairy who could get their hands on the prince would be held to the highest honor, a trap Roman never hoped to be ensnared in. Sweat coated his brow as he finally slowed to a stop. He wasn't sure how far he'd gone, only that the kingdom was a fair distance away. Good. Roman didn't plan on returning any time soon, especially not when the song of the trees flowed through his ears, pulling him forward with invisible strings. He strained against the desire, not willing to travel too far into the trees. Even when breaking the rules, the prince knew what came to those who followed the call. But even so, the melody, it was so enticing. It felt as if cherries and sugar had been poured on his tongue, sticky sweet. The air blew past as if millions of flowers had covered the land, filling his nose with the gentle scent of lavender and lilac. He felt his limbs numb, volition no longer an option as the trees coaxed him into another step, deeper. Something in the back of Roman's mind called to him. This was wrong. Something had been broken, though the prince couldn't seem to care. Not until a blood-curdling scream pierced through the treetops. Roman broke from his daze, the sweet smell shifting into that of smoke, sharp and flaring. The chorus sung by the trees disappeared, replaced only by that scream, desperate and filled with a pain like no other. Any other man may have fled then, deciding the rules of the woods truly were worth considering, though Roman was not that man. He snapped his head up, whirling towards where the sound again erupted from the foliage. Then, turning on his heel, he sprinted right towards the sound. It grew louder with each step, frantic. Roman rushed to keep up with its wailing tone. Sweat doused his brow and his feet throbbed with each pounding step, though the prince was far from stopping. He whipped around corners, avoiding stray roots that littered the ground. Louder, the sound grew until it was enough to leave even birds desperate to fly away. Roman didn't dare turn back, and as the cries grew, the trees seemed to break into a clearing, almost as if they beckoned him to what lay inside. He entered the clearing, and the words were stolen from his throat, leaving him gasping. There was someone, lying in the center of the clearing. His form trembled like that of a leaf, pained gasps escaping his lips as he struggled to wrench free from something. Roman stepped closer, curious, and that was when he saw it. Twin shackles of iron encircled his wrists, and beneath it, the skin seared. Chains of the same metal had been wrapped around a tree and secured to the bands, pinning the fairy to the trunk. His wings were pressed flat against the bark, and small burns littered the places the iron had brushed against his skin. Another cry fell from the fairy's lips, and his head slumped, exhaustion and agony overtaking his body. His eyes drifted to Roman, and the prince swore he saw the fairy mouth a silent plea before going limp against the shackles that scorched his skin. Everything Roman had heard before told him to run. A trick, they would say. Just another way for them to steal you from the world you know. Though, as Roman looked to the Fae, there was a deep pain in his eyes. He ignored the voices reciting countless warnings, inhaling with a deep breath and approaching the trapped fairy. The other seemed to notice this, his eyes growing wide as he frantically tried to pull away from Roman's outstretched hand. "It's all right," Roman whispered. "Don't be afraid." The fairy shook his head, yanking harder on the chains even as they pressed further into his skin. He winced, though did not cease to struggle. "Don't. You'll only wound yourself more." Roman tried to reach out again, and the fairy inhaled sharply, hot tears running down his cheeks. "No," he sobbed. "Please, get away." "I'm not going to hurt you." "Don't lie." The Fae grimaced as the iron scorched the tips of his wings. "I'm not," Roman said, stepping closer. "I promise." With this, the fairy froze, eyeing the prince with something akin to hesitance. "You promise?" "You have my word." Something flashed in the fairy's eyes, and he did not flinch away this time, allowing Roman to inspect the bands around his wrists. A hinge lay at the back of each, as if the mechanism had been specifically designed to snare its prey on contact. A trap, and a wicked one at that. Roman unsheathed the dagger at his side, ignoring the way the other trembled at the sight of the weapon. The tip of the blade found the pins between the hinges, and he offered a reassuring glance as he wedged the blade between the mechanism. Iron hit the forest floor. The chains slumped from where they had been wrapped around the tree, and both shackles hit the grass with a dull thud. The fairy stood frozen, smoke still drifting from where iron had impaired his skin. He lazily glanced at the prince before his knees buckled, and he fell to the forest floor. Roman rushed forward, catching the fairy just before he hit the ground. A whimper escaped his lips, his half-lidded eyes struggling to remain open as Roman shifted him so his back leaned against the trunk. "It's all right," he said. "You'll be okay." Roman hoped those words were true. The fairy glanced up weakly, his voice a mere whisper. "It hurts. I don't know how to help you." "My home," the fairy mumbled. "Take me there, please." A million warnings flashed through Roman's mind. Entering a Fae's home was a death wish, a ploy to fall into capture. Would the one lying before him really be cruel enough to stage such a trap? Roman narrowed his eyes. "How do I know this isn't a trick?" The Fae paused for a moment, considering. "My name," he whispered. "My name is Patton." The prince froze. Names were everything in the forest. By having possession of such things alone, Roman could ward him off if needed. Why give him this power when in such a vulnerable state? Though Roman supposed that was exactly it. Patton was weakened, and Roman was all he had. He sighed, standing and lifting the one called Patton into his arms. He was limp in his hold, coming to rest his head on the prince's shoulder, with nothing to say other than, "Move straight ahead. The forest will guide you." Roman obeyed. He walked on, step by step as a wind blew past his face. It again sung in his ear, guiding him farther down an invisible path. Fear pooled in his stomach, though he pushed it away. If this was all a trick, then he would surely go out in glory. Only, nothing of danger arrived. He continued to move, Patton teetering on the edge of consciousness in his arms. All he had to guide him was the wind and the parting of trees. Their leaves blew through the air, tracing a path of green and yellow until finally golden shingles came into view. A cottage. He stumbled inside and searched for somewhere to place the fairy. There, in the very corner of the room, was a bed, adorned with a silver quilt. Roman rushed to the spot, carefully laying Patton onto the mattress and draping the quilt over his shoulders. The material was unlike any fabric he had ever seen. It looked as if it was millions of spiderwebs, each thread interlocking with the morning dew still dripping down its surface. Pure magic. Patton winced, and Roman was then reminded of the task at hand. "What do I do?" he asked. The fairy rose into a sitting position, even the small movements searing with pain. "Blue jar," he rasped. "Please." The prince obliged, following Patton's gaze to find a shelf in the corner of the room. Dozens of jars had been placed on the surface, all containing different substances. Sunlight sparkled off the transparent glass of each, though only one of the containers shone blue. He plucked the jar from the shelf and rushed back to Patton's side. Roman unscrewed the lid to reveal a cream, to which he spread across Patton's burns. The Fae grimaced as the mixture came into contact with his skin, though did not flinch away. Roman searched the room for bandages, finding the space to be lacking of such things. He resorted to the next best thing. Threads split, the delicate stitching ceasing to matter as Roman tore the sleeve of his tunic. He wrapped the strips around the treated burns, opting for damaged clothing rather than chancing what could easily become an infection. As he finished tying off the last strip, Patton's eyes filled with nothing short of awe. "Thank you," he whispered. The prince nodded, unsure of what else to say. Patton offered a gentle smile and slowly tried to stand. He inhaled sharply at the movement, but did not accept Roman's attempt to aid him. Using the frame of the bed as support, the fairy finally stood, and Roman held in a gasp as he truly took in the sight of the fairy for the first time. Light curls cascaded down his forehead, framing the sharp lines of his jaw and the point of his ears. His eyes sparkled a bright blue, and Roman could have sworn he was looking into the sky itself. Wire spectacles framed those eyes, rounded and placed delicately on his nose. It was as if the human form had been twisted into nothing short of ethereal beauty. His pale skin was adorned with freckles, speckled across his body like stars. Blue cloth hung loosely from his body, draping delicately around his shoulders and hips. Silver beads adorned the garment, and a collection of such formed a circlet around Patton's forehead. With his slim form, he towered above Roman, and absolutely nothing could compare to those wings. Wings, sparkling a light sky blue. Wings that slumped towards the ground, the edges battered with the after effects of iron, yet still managing to appear breathtaking. It was like staring at the personification of a butterfly, beautiful and delicate, though Roman knew the Fae were anything but delicate. "Are you all right?" Patton asked, and only then did Roman realize he had been staring. "Oh, yes, I'm fine. I've just never seen a fairy up close before." A smile crept onto Patton's lips. "Well, I'm glad to be the first." He ambled over to the counter of the room that served as a kitchen. "After all you've done to help me, I can only assume you're hungry. Can I get you anything to eat?" Never accept food from the Fae. The old command echoed in Roman's ears, retold in countless warnings. Do such things, and they could claim you as their own. "No, thank you," Roman muttered, and he could have sworn he saw Patton's face fall, though a moment later he was back to his smiling self. "You're lost, kiddo. I made cookies this morning." He smiled, stealing away one of the morsels from a baking sheet. Smells of chocolate and brown sugar flowed through the air, and Roman would be a fool to say they didn't seem absolutely delectable. He pushed his cravings away, instead joining Patton at a small table in the corner of the room. The fairy smiled as he sat, almost as if delighted by the company. Roman couldn't decide whether he felt unsettled or welcomed. "Don't tell anyone, but I'm taking a second cookie today," Patton whispered with a giggle, and Roman found his lips curling into a smile. This fairy was nothing like the rumors, at least, not now. A quiet settled over the room as Patton ate, leaving only the sounds of the forest outside. Roman shifted, the silence of the room quickly growing uncomfortably heavy. Emptiness was never something he enjoyed, and with each second that passed, he grew more and more restless until he finally asked, "How were you ensnared in the first place?" Patton glanced up from his treats, something short of terror flashing in his eyes. "The hunters." "The what?" "Have you never heard of the hunters?" Patton's eyes dimmed as Roman shook his head. He sighed, setting down his second cookie. "They are cruel people who seek the wealth of my people. Though fairies are hated throughout these lands, we have one thing forth. Our wings are enough to make a poor man never have to pay another cent in his life, and the hunters won't stop until they've stolen this." Roman met his eyes. "That's horrible." Patton nodded solemnly, his fingers coming up to fiddle with his bandages. "Today, I wasn't paying attention. I didn't notice they had glamored a trap until it was too late. If it wasn't for you, they would have surely taken me." "But only Fae can glamour. How did they gain that magic?" "Through other fairies," Patton muttered, his gaze trailing to the floor. "They steal them away, and rather than just removing their wings and leaving them to die, they keep them alive. They leave them suffering just so they can capture more. I'm so sorry, Roman said. He hadn't known such people even existed. Something sharp panged in his heart. If he'd been oblivious to this, what other cruel secrets hid under his watch? Patton gave a saddened smile. It's all right. Like others of my kind, I still managed to survive. Though, I thank you for saving me today. That doesn't change the fact that you're still hurt. No, I suppose it doesn't. Patton's gaze drifted to the singed marks on his wings. Weeks, even months, would be needed to repair that damage. But I could be dead. Roman smiled gently. I suppose that's an optimistic take on it. I find my days are always better with a bit of sunshine, he grinned, moving to stand from the table. It's getting quite dark out. Would you like to stay the night? Oh, that's all right. I need to get home. It's dangerous outside. I wouldn't want you to get hurt. I'll be fine, Roman insisted. Staying any longer was surely more dangerous than anything lying in the woods. Not to mention those in the palace were probably panicked by his absence. I really have to get home. Patton sighed. Very well. He joined Roman as they walked towards the doorway, stopping just before the prince stopped outside. Roman tried not to think about how much the Fae towered over him, easily capable of overpowering him at the slightest of hand. Even when injured, Roman did not know how much power flowed in Patton's magic. He reached for the door handle. With each second, the sky only grew darker, a hint to the growing dangers in the forest. He would have to travel fast if he wished to make it home safe. Before you go, the fairy blurted, eyes darting nervously, I have something for you. Roman turned, raising a brow. What is? His sentence was cut off as Patton captured his lips with his own, breaking away with a quick breath. Roman's eyes grew wide, and he flinched at the glow that began to crawl over his skin. A band of stripes weaved around him, blazing the same color of Patton's wings. Roman shuddered as they snaked across his forearm, the light finally dimming into a gentle gleam. What did you do to me? Roman choked, gaping at the marks on his skin. Marks that didn't disappear as he brushed them with his finger. Like ink, a permanent installment. A bargain, Patton said, as if such words could heal the rising panic in the prince's veins. A twin blemish marked the fairy's skin, though he didn't appear to be the slightest bit fazed. You saved my life, and I will be indebted to you until I can do the same. A fair trade for your services. Trade? Roman's breast quickened. All he could focus on was the glint to the Fae's eyes and the marks scattered across his forearm. I didn't want a trade. Patton fiddled with his fingers. The cheer he possessed before had vanished, gone like the sun behind the horizon. I just wished to help. I don't want your help. I never asked for this, Roman exclaimed, tears pricking his eyes. Branded, he had been bound to the Fae, stuck, just like back home. He couldn't take it, so he ran. He yanked the door open and sprinted, his feet pounding as fast as his heart. Wait, please, Patton called from the doorway, but Roman ignored it. The Fae didn't try to follow him. Wind brushed past his cheeks, threading through his hair and leaving his clothes flapping around his sides. It no longer smelled of flowers and sweets, but of iron and shadow. The trees ceased to part for him, leaving him veering around trunks jutting out from the soil like broken bones. He increased his speed, pushing away the burn of his lungs. Breaths quick and shallow, he could not end the racing of his mind. A fool he had been to let his guard down. tricked by the same fairy he had been warned of all his life. He should have listened to the warnings. Maybe then he wouldn't be bound by a tattoo of blue and silver. Tears flecked his cheeks no matter how hard he tried to hold them back. Just a bit farther, and he would reach the safety of home, away from all of this, and the horrors lying within this wretched forest. Snap! Roman didn't have a moment to breathe before the ground was rushing up to meet him. He collided hard with the forest floor, dirt stinging his eyes. Fresh scrapes now littered his body, already scarlet with blood, though something else was amiss. He sat up coughing, and there it was. A shackle of iron clamped tightly around his ankle, and just beyond it, chain links securing it tightly to a tree. "No, not now," he muttered. He tried to pull away, though the band held firm, biting into his skin with iron hinges. Roman yanked at the chains. "Come on," he hissed, flinching with each rattle that echoed through the forest, alerting the monsters of his weakened state. "This can't be happening, not now." The shackles didn't budge, moonlight glinting off each chain link as if in mockery. He pulled harder, his heart beating frantically inside of his chest, all until a voice echoed through the forest that left him frozen. "Well, well, well, look what we have here." Roman turned, heart dropping at the sight of 4 men before him. Hunters. 3 flanked the front, grinning, while 1 lay farther back, shrouded in shadow. The one in front grinned, stepping forward and leaning over the snared prince. "You look a long way from home, boy. What are you doing in the forest of the Fae at such an hour?" "I was lost." "This is a mighty rare place to get lost. Do you know how unsafe these woods are?" There was a glint to his eye, and the 2 behind him chuckled, the sound making Roman's blood run cold. "I am quite aware, which is why I was on my way home before you decided to interrupt me." The man raised a brow. "I'm not so sure I believe that. The fairy people are tricksters at heart, and masters of glamoring. I've seen dozens of others just like you before." Roman frowned, eyes narrowed. "I am no liar. Unlock these chains and let me return home." "Not just yet." The hunter signaled the man veiled in shadow, and only as he stepped into the moonlight did Roman notice the point to his ears. He didn't want to think of the scars that lined his back, once displaying where wings used to be. The fairy spared him a glance, shoulders slumping as if he knew what was to come. "Remove this fairy's glamour. I wish to see his true form." The Fae nodded, flashing Roman a saddened glance and leaning over him, reaching out a hand. Roman drew back and unsheathed his dagger. "Don't touch me, or I swear I'll shred your partner to pieces." The fairy stilled, but the hunter behind him only laughed. Roman gripped his weapon tighter, and the man advanced forward, grinning wickedly. "You have quite the fire, don't you?" He grabbed Roman's wrist, twisting the dagger so the point lay at Roman's throat. "I'd learn to quench your spirit." "Let me go." "You are hardly in the position to make commands." The hunter again looked to the fairy. "Wipe the glamour away." Roman thrashed in his hold to no avail. The man's grip was like a vice, leaving Roman's bones aching in his grasp. Cool hands lay atop his head, and for a moment everything grew silent. When the Fae finally broke away, his face displayed a mixture of confusion and relief. "There is no glamour. The boy is human." "Then what were you doing in the woods at this hour?" Roman gulped. "Like I said, I got lost." "Sure you did." The hunter narrowed his eyes, before his gaze slipped to the weapon in Roman's hand. A dagger just like any other, except for one thing. He smirked. Wandering travelers don't carry the royal crest on their weapons. Roman blanched, and that was all the confirmation the hunter needed. You know, I bet a stolen prince would offer quite the ransom. How much do you think those in the palace would pay to get their precious ruler back? Don't. Please. It's all just business, young prince. He stood, eyes gleaming as he nodded to his companions. Restrain him, though don't cause harm. I'll need the monarch alive if we want any payment. Roman's eyes grew wide. He jumped back, dodging the hunter's grasps. There was only so far he could go before the chain reached its end. The links pulled taut, wrenching Roman's feet from under him. He fell with a grunt and whirled around to face the hunters. Hands encircled his wrists, gripping tightly as he tried to fight back. He kicked and thrashed, muscles on fire, though the grasp on him did not loosen. It was over. The prince had been caught. A pretty thing like you will surely provide a fortune, the leader returned, placing a hand under Roman's chin and tilting his face up to meet his eyes. The prince recoiled at the touch, but the hunter only tightened his grasp. Be still now. A few thousand coins later, and you'll be back in your precious palace. Like heck I will, Roman glared, spitting in the hunter's face. He pulled back, though the grin on his face did not falter. With a nod to the fairy at his side, he said, Put him to sleep. We don't need him fighting to escape before a deal has been made. Something short of sorrow crossed the eyes of the Fae, maybe even defiance, but whatever courage he had possessed vanished long ago. He moved towards the prince, arm outstretched as an indigo glow began to emanate from his palm. No, wait, please don't do this, Roman cried, struggling against the grip on his arms. Let go of me. I'm sorry, he whispered, something close to tears pricking his eyes as Roman's vision was surrounded by cobalt. The prince squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the magic to take over. He could feel its pull. His eyes grew heavy, his mind already wandering into the space between dreams. Roman tried to fight the limpness in his limbs, begging his mind to stay awake just a moment longer. To fight, to cry out, anything. The edges of his vision faded black, consciousness slipping until there was nothing left in its wake. He had failed, yet there in the distance. Get your hands away from him. A voice rumbled low through the forest, cutting through the fog of Roman's mind and sending him reeling. His eyes refused to open, still slack with the fatigued magic. Footsteps. He heard dozens. All of them rushed, pounding against the soil in a run. Through the blur of his thoughts, Roman could make out muffled speech. Release him right now, the voice commanded. Even the trees seemed to tremble in its presence. You have no place being out here now, fairy. Go home. I said, release him. Louder, the voice growled, and with it, an uneasiness carried through the air. Roman didn't need to see to know that the hunter was glowering at the intruder, challenging him with nothing more than a wicked glance. Make me, he spat, and that was when the screaming began. A flash, bright and blazing, shone through even the cover of Roman's eyelids. He gasped, and suddenly he was careening towards the ground, no longer held by the pull of magic. The prince blinked his eyes open to find the once proud hunter now trembling at the base of the tree trunk, his two comrades not too far behind. And above it all stood Patton, teeth bared and swirling in a sea of blue and silver. The wounds littering his body didn't so much as faze him, existing only as the slightest glint in his eye. If anything, they fueled Patton's fury, twisting around him with a magic full of light. "I told you to release him," he growled, and Roman nearly shook with fear himself. This was nothing like the Fae he had met in the woods just before. "It is not kind to dismiss a command." I'm sorry," the hunter muttered, singed holes still smoking on his clothing. Patton grinned. "Take this as a lesson, then, human. Harm my kind, and I will be second to strike." He raised his hand, and from it spouted a beam of sunlight. It burned with the firing intensity, quenched as Patton closed his fist. "Go," he said, "and never return to these woods. I don't forgive as easily for unwelcome returners." The 3 hunters were gone before Roman could even blink. He slumped to the ground, where Patton caught him in his arms. The fairy began to rub slow circles onto his back, and Roman leaned into the touch. Safe at last. "Why did you come for me?" he whispered, pressing his cheek against the warmth of Patton's chest. "I made a bargain, remember? You saved my life, and I bound myself to be indebted to you until I could fulfill what you did for me." The prince looked to his forearm, and sure enough, the mark circling his skin had vanished. It was then that Roman could no longer hold back tears. He wept, not even caring that he was in the arms of a fairy. Patton only held him tighter, carding a hand through his hair and whispering reassurances. "They're gone now," he said, pressing a kiss to Roman's hair. "You're all right." "I'm so sorry," Roman mumbled against his chest, hating the way he had soaked the Fae's clothing in tears. "The things I said to you, I didn't know." "Shh. It's all right. Just focus on my breathing. In and out, just like that." Roman followed the rise and fall of Patton's chest. Invisible counts tapped onto his back with each inhale and exhale. The beating in his heart soon slowed, and he glanced up to see Patton gazing down at him with those beautiful blue eyes. "Thank you for everything." "Of course, my prince." Roman stilled, whirling around to meet Patton's eyes. "How did you know I was a prince?" "Your clothing," Patton said simply, his fingers brushing delicately over the bandages concealing his injuries. "Commoners don't possess fabric with so many threads. I could feel the layers, the work that was put into each strip." He smiled. You aren't fooling any fairy, even with clothing as simple as that. "He speaks the truth," someone called from the shadows. His form revealed as he stepped into the moonlight. The taken Fae. "Our senses reach much farther than those foolish humans. I knew you weren't Fae even before I checked for a glamour." "Why didn't you reveal my identity then?" "The band on your wrist suggests that you helped my people. Not all bargains leave marks of beauty, and yours seem to be made in good spirits." He sighed. "I was not expecting my leader to spot the royal crest, and I apologize for everything that occurred after." "It wasn't like you had much of a choice." "That still doesn't condone what I have done, both to you and to others of my kind. I was foolish once, and now thousands of others have suffered from my mistake." The fairy looked to the ground. Everything he had seen over the years, had to endure. Roman couldn't even imagine the pain. "What's your name?" Roman found himself asking, curious. The fairy glanced up, almost surprised. His voice was quiet as he spoke, as if he hadn't been allowed to share such things for so long, stripped clean of any sense of self, until he met Roman's eyes, and with a small smile, said, "Logan. My name is Logan." Both Roman and Patton reflected his smile. The gesture wasn't much, though Logan practically shone with the support of something so distinctive. "Well then," Roman said, smiling almost as sweet as the flowers of the forest. "Thank you for helping me, Logan." "I did not do much to aid you. I hardly believe I deserve your thanks." "You don't have to." Roman moved forward, placing a hand over the face. "But I will thank you regardless. Even your small assistance has meant the world to me." Patton nodded, shifting to sit beside the prince. "Even the littlest things can prove to be life-saving. If there is anything you need, I would be glad to help you. Those hunters won't bother you or the people of this forest anymore." Like an invisible tether thrown into the darkness, he watched the fairy climb out of the shadow and into light. The light of safety and something worth caring for. "Thank you," Logan whispered, eyes glittering with the light of 1,000 stars. "I haven't received such kindness in years. Your hospitality is something I will be forever grateful for." Patton smiled and glanced up to the sky. The sparkling of stars had begun to fade, and with it, the sky melted into a deep violet. Yellows and pinks peaked just above the horizon, dawn moments away. "It's nearing morning. What do you say we head to my cottage? I have plenty of food and water, and you may use any of my quilts to sleep tonight, and however many you may need after." "I would like that," Logan muttered. He stepped forward, moving hesitantly for once outside the shadows of the forest. Patton stood and accompanied his side, guiding him back to the place he called home. Roman watched from where he stood, hands on his hips and a smile on his face. He had reached his happy ending, it seemed. Funny, how it had not been the Fae he feared, but humankind. Ultimately, his breaking of the rules meant to protect had been what saved him. The corners of his lips turned up at the sight before him. Logan stuck close to Patton's side, turning every so often to ensure the fairy was still all right with his presence. Just before the two Fae reached a break in the trees, Patton turned back around, and Roman was again met with those dazzling blue eyes. "Are you coming?" he called, something close to hope shining on his face. Roman's expression dimmed with the question. They both felt the answer on their tongue, though acknowledging such things hurt more than the cold bite of iron. "You know I can't, Patton. A prince can't stray from his duties." "But what if you did?" It hurt to see the desire in Patton's eyes, pleading him to stay a day longer, to grow with him and Logan until they could forget the cruelties of the outside world, the responsibilities. Hadn't that been what Roman had been trying to escape before this adventure started? Both sides would only end in tatters, though, if he left the world he knew. For Roman knew if he followed them to the cottage, he may just never leave. So instead, he stepped across the uneven soil until his face was inches from Patton's own, and kissed him. Patton's eyes grew wide as they parted only a moment later, blue swirls surrounding them both. It swarmed like waves crashing, glowing with a magic that left everyone gaping. And just as fast as it had come, it vanished. Patton looked down to find scarlet lines encircling his wrist, like ink, permanent until fulfilled. "You made a bargain?" he breathed, and Roman nodded. "I can't join you just yet, but someday I will return. Until then, I will be bound to you through a promise not even the strongest of magic can break." But Roman, deals like this are dangerous. What if... The prince held up a finger before Patton could finish the sentence, a glint in his eyes. I will not break this bargain. For all you've done for me, I promise I will see you again. The words struck deep. He felt them resonate through the trees, bristling the leaves clear as the new morning. Now even the forest knew. Nothing would keep him from fulfilling such a deal, and this seemed to sink into Patton's mind with a final peace. I'll await your arrival then, Roman, he sighed. And until that day, we will wait for you. Roman bowed, a goodbye without words, and by the time he had looked up, the fairies had vanished. He reached the palace gates just as morning broke. The bright beams of summer broke through the trees in the next months. Each time they did, Roman was reminded of Patton, the fae who had poured love and light into everything he held dear, but who could also grow cold and sharp, like a blade, poised to strike those who endangered the life of sunshine. Every so often, Roman caught a glimpse of this fairy. Stacking books in the library, he would catch a flash of blue through the window. Tending to the gardens, he swore he saw sparkling blue eyes peek out from the brush. Walking the palace grounds, he felt the warmth of sun beat down on his back like a silent embrace, the beams wrapping around his body in a way that no sunlight could do by its lonesome. And in each of these, he felt the soft hold of the band around his wrist, the same one staining the skin of Patton. There was a promise he still had to uphold. When the crown once again weighed too heavily, Roman did the one thing that had worked months before. He ran. This time, he embraced the forest's pull. This has been a deal of Fables and Fairies. Thank you so much for listening, and also thank you so much to our Shadow for leaving this prompt request in the first place. If you would like to leave a request of your own, you can either comment on this video, or you can go down a few videos to the one labeled announcements and leave it commented there. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time for another story.